Hello and welcome to Monarchism Unfiltered. I'm one of your hosts, Mikolsk,
This is Bronze.
Zion.
and on today's episode, we've decided to talk about the ever pertinent topic of distributivism.
Is distributism though? Because you hear about it a lot on the internet. It's like nouvelle cuisine, but for ideology. You're too young. Because what it is it's because we should give some background to the kids about what it is to distribute. Whomst is a Chesterton and all that. It's an economic ideology. Well, some would say it's an ideology, but we'll get to that later. Started in the aftermath of the 1891 encyclical Rerum Novarum, which was a condemnation of modern industrial capitalism and also of state socialism. And so, distributism is sort of comes out of that background of being opposed to both like completely unfettered capitalism and also radical socialism. And what its basis is that it, together with Marxism, realized that the important thing is property, right? Like who owns it, who has it, like that is the distinguishing feature. It's not, income or whatever Piketty talks about. It's property. But instead of abolishing private property like the Marxists seek to, because most distributors hold that that's not really a thing that is actually possible or desirable. It seeks to distribute, hence the name, the property to as many people as possible. The idea is that everyone should have some property. Is as Chesterton famously put it, the problem isn't that there are too many capitalists. The problem is there's not enough of them. So that from there comes this whole slogan of 3 acres and a cow. That.
Um, it's quite interesting that you mentioned the not enough, because it does seem to me, especially if you look at the history of, if you look at the history of the of 20th century and basically the history of the last 100 years or so since Chesterton, we have seen an increasing rate of centralization and it seems to me that that critique is probably more relevant now than it used to be, at least in terms of like the number of corporations or whatever that have control over most things.
Yeah, there's been a sharp trend towards oligopoly.
I mean it's so, because I know that I think that really is the core issue that we have been seeing is that when you have, say, in the US, um, three or four, I don't know, for example, cell providers or something, um, across the entire country, their ability to collude and to delimit where they operate such that they can have functional monopolies in certain areas, um, is quite extreme, and more extreme even than, say, in the days of US, like robber barons and so forth. Um,
I mean, this is the world that Chesterton and also Belloc were sort of coming out of. You know, when they were writing, Rockefeller was still alive. So that
Rockefeller was a towering figure of, well, still is in the minds of many about what capitalism is or should be, depending upon who you ask.
yeah, because essentially what he was like Jeff Bezos, but on a bigger scale, which is sort of hard to imagine. But I mean the key flaw, and because many people find distributism appealing because it has a very for lack of a better, holistic image. We've all got 3 acres and there's small businesses flourishing everywhere. But there's a key flaw, which is that distributism within itself does not have the process of building itself. How does one do a distributism? Because, for example, for socialism, that's pretty clear. You have a revolution, and there's a whole historical process leading up to it. With the capitalism, you force it, and then you have the businesses, and then they compete, and then they grow and stuff. But
And then the contradictions within the capital get accelerated, the whole thing comes crumbling down, or is destroyed via a socialist revolution, and through another long and sometimes vague process, you have socialism slash communism at the end.
Yeah, it's there's so socialism and capitalism, they have sort of systems on how you build them. Like for example, Nicholas Barbon, which I mean, we don't really put like much emphasis on how to get to capitalism, since we're already there. But pre-capitalist authors who were like, this is how we need to build a capitalism, they have that process pretty much figured out. I mean, they figured it out. But how do you do a distributism? Because you can't just say, oh, the state comes in and redistributes the property, because that violates its own principles. So really, what you're left with is the whole idea that, oh well, vote with your wallet, shop local and patron local businesses, which is, sure, that's good and everything, but it's not really helpful, because often you don't have that choice. Or even if you do have, nominally speaking, that choice, it might not be like a very realistic choice for you to take. Like if shopping at the massive chain supermarket is going to cost half as much as shopping from the organic local producer, then most people probably might go for the the supermarket. They might not have a choice because they need to eat. And so I don't think that distributism in and of itself is a tenable ideological position, because it doesn't have the ability to build itself. And so saying you are a distributist is sort of not very meaningful.
I mean, to many, the term has become like a blanket statement, like when one defines themselves as vaguely centrist to center right or right wing, but anti-capitalist. The term itself has been kind of also emptied out of any possible referential meaning by these days.
I mean, I think that's probably in part because um, people don't read enough, and so you're like, especially when you get onto, you can see this like, oh, Wikipedia. Wikipedia has this whole list of political ideologies. So you can label yourself whatever.
Dartboard and pick one.
Wikipedia, the sole thing that gives legitimacy to everything. If you have a Wikipedia page, you are legit.
But and I think that's a valid point of not reading enough, because there's not that much to read for compared to, say, capitalism or socialism. Because like, who are you gonna read as a distributist?
Well, you can read Rerum Novarum in Latin.
Yeah, you can read. Yeah. So you've got Rerum Novarum, and then you have the writings of Belloc and Chesterton. That's most of it. But even they don't provide a satisfactory answer to how do you do one. Belloc tries in what is it called?
Economics for Helen.
No, his essay on the restoration of property. He makes an attempt on how you would, but it's not very satisfactory. It wouldn't work to, it's not applicable today. So I think that you would need to supplement. So I think for that reason, I don't think that like you can say that you are a distributist, and that sort of adequately explains like an economic output. So really, distributism.
Sorry, just briefly, before you get on to what you think distributism is or should be, could you briefly explain why you think that Belloc doesn't provide a satisfactory answer for how to get to distributism, to restore property, just like in the modern day, basically, or what the issue you see in the modern day would be?
I mean, essentially, what it does, okay, because it most I think the essay on the restoration of property is worth reading because it provides, in a sense, like a foundation on how we got where we are, or rather, how Belloc got to where he is in the when was it written? In the first half of the 20th century, and it's still sort of qualitatively where we are today. But he doesn't like have a full solution. He has a couple of ideas, like supporting local businesses or like rethinking how we do economics. So, taking the quite Catholic view that, we have to consider it more as a branch of moral philosophy than we do now, which I think is valid. But he lays the groundwork for that's the thing we need to do, but he doesn't do it himself. He doesn't in It doesn't lay out a complete plan of how to get from capitalism to distributism.
Yeah, I mean that makes quite a bit of sense. So I think that then gets into your point about, or I think it might be interesting then to explore the point about moral philosophy next,
Yeah,
to
and
just use it as a sort of structure, as it were.
yeah, I think it has to be. And Belloc talks about this in Economics for Helen, in that you can't divorce economics from morality, because that's meaningless then at that point, right? Because if you have the science of human decision, then surely morality is involved in those decisions and should be, because what does it mean to like make an economic, like even if you make like just a purely descriptive model of how the world works, you don't have any ideas of this is what we should do, or this is what I think how it should work in the future. You just say this is what stuff is now. Even then you have to get into the morality of it, because of you can't model humans without at least a little bit going into the morality. And if you're going to go into prescriptivism, which despite what the 21st century is, eventually you have to, because if you want to build a good system, eventually you have to delineate, okay, so this is when it's a good system. And you have to define it being a good system on some sort of moral basis.
Or you just like, or the
What's
system,
the point
or
of
the
having
whole
a good
rationale
system?
just
Like,
collapses
why is it
because
good? And
it
you have to
becomes a
explain
why are
why
we
it's
doing
good.
this kind of question.
And then you can like appeal to like that, oh, it's just, or it enables freedom, and that's a different. But you have to have that conversation.
it's quite interesting then, because it does seem to me that increasingly, like if you compare economics now to say um, Smith or Ricardo or these like very early ones, it seems to me that it's become more and more apolitical compared to say Austrian economics, which, as far as I can tell, is kind of considered uh, like astrology, as it were.
I mean, there's been a tendency to try and become more and more descriptive as opposed to prescriptive.
Yeah, I mean, do you think there's any reasons for that? That like in,
I think it's because like it's easier, and that sounds like a stupid answer, but I think that's
I mean, I don't think it is a stupid answer. I
no,
mean,
yeah. I mean, it sounds stupid. I think it because it's so much easier, right? Because you just have
you don't have to think really. You can just sort of say this is how things are.
well, I mean, you have to think a bit because usually the world is quite complicated, so figuring it out how to describe it is I don't think prescriptive no, sorry, descriptive economists are stupid because a lot of them are very clearly very intelligent people. But I think it's a different sort of heart.
Would you agree with the assessment that they have kind of given up on the whole project of trying to
I mean, there's whole
moralize
schools that think that's
capitalism?
possible. I mean, like there's whole schools that I mean, there's whole schools that argue stuff like the government shouldn't do anything during like market crashes because like that's the market like readjusting itself. So the degree to which
I, but usually the people who say that usually try to make the argument that in the long term that's worse for most people. They usually try. It's not that the divine justice of the market gets disturbed, so we can help people. I think they do make the argument that it's better for people if we let the market do its thing, and then sort of try to pick up the people left behind without sort of, as it were, fucking over the debt cycle.
what the interesting part there, obviously, where you bring in the divine justice part, is the point that it does seem to me, at least, that they ascribe to the market a kind of collective transcendent agency akin to that of like God. Um, like to the degree that it does almost seem that they're being almost more metaphysical than even say a distributist or like um, someone basing arguments for how the economy should be on moral principles.
Yeah, I mean, I think they sort of make the case that no, you can't. I'm going to borrow from Benjamin Graham, which is not he's not really because he's not in the political economy game. He's in the finance theory game of how you use money markets to make money. That's the game he's in. But essentially, he's saying you can't be cleverer than the market. Stockbrokers can't beat the market because that would entail them being more intelligent than themselves, since they are the market. And I think that's the sort of situation. You know, if we are all the market, because if you go, for example, with Hayek, he does state that the market is organic. There's no the market as its own thing. It's just us. So we can't outsmart the market because that would essentially then we'd have to outsmart ourselves because the market has all the perspectives in it.
Okay, but I mean, even then, you just saying that still makes it quite metaphysical. I mean,
It's physical. I'm just trying to sort of that's what
you're
seems.
trying to explain it, but like the
I'm not defending the position. I'm just saying
yeah,
that's what they say.
yeah. I mean, sorry. I mean, it's quite interesting though that they have the thing about the market can't be outsmarted because the market has all the perspectives in it. Um, because Ibn Sina or Avicenna specifically argued that there must be a single human intellect thinking at all possible times on the basis of a couple of Aristotle arguments. Um, and it's quite strange to me because it at least from what you described, it seems like uh, Hayek is an Avicennaist, um, which is a sort of bizarre situation that sort of uh, you kind of write yourself into. Um, this has obviously gotten off track. You were saying about moral philosophy and distributism and as critique. What specifically do you see further for that?
Yeah, I mean, most of the big distributist theorists are explicitly religious. Not majority Catholic, but not even necessarily, but consistently explicitly religious, and so that's why they have an easier time of doing the moral philosophy, because they can say church says this, you know because if Christ says that you need to clothe the naked and feed the starving, then clearly the duty of an economic system should be to perform those acts, because those are worthy acts to perform, which I think that's reasonable enough.
Yeah, I mean that seems fair to me.
Disclaimer being that I am also explicitly religious, so
Yeah, I mean that seems to me to be quite fair.
I mean, but even if you aren't, I think that people shouldn't starve is something a lot of people can agree to, unless you believe that the divine justice of the common intellect of all humans is dignified enough to, damn people to starvation if you're Malthus.
Yeah, well, I mean even Hayek. Um,
Hayek is, the thing is that Malthus isn't even, because he believes that you can, like, he's not even anti-interfering with the market, but he's saying if you've interfered it to where you want it to be, and then that leads to people starving, then those people just need to starve.
I mean Malthus's argument isn't about markets; it's about how productive
About the
the world
availability
is.
of resources.
Yeah. So it's not even about the distribution of those resources.
I think there's not enough.
He's saying there's never like that there will be a point where there cannot be enough because um
Land grows, like the production grows arithmetically, and population grows exponentially. And so you'll always have points where the population catches up to production, and then it has to drop.
yeah, which is I think that's different claim compared to claiming that the market knows best and thus um you should just like accept that there will be homeless people or like whatever because in the long run there won't be basically condemn people to starve now in exchange for like salvation later.
Yeah, so that there is that, but some people, other Austrians. I don't know that I don't think Hayek specifically goes into this, but other Austrians from after him go, maybe those people deserve to be homeless because they didn't work hard enough to have homes. So that, I think, that's harder to stomach than we have in the long term, because he still makes the point that like limiting the amount of total homeless people in the long run is good, which is I think is different from saying they deserve to be homeless.
So was he pro any state intervention then, or not?
He was because he wasn't an anarchist, so he was, uh Hayek wasn't. No, he was a lib. No, so I think
He
the
was
way
a
you describe it
classic,
in modern
wasn't
terms
he?
is he was pro fiscal intervention, not pro monetary intervention.
So what's the
Like it's okay for the state to set up a soup kitchen, but
What,
it wouldn't be
what's the
okay for the
difference?
state
Yes.
to like fuck with interest rates to end the crisis sooner, if that makes sense.
Oh, so he was pro welfare against like just bailing everyone out.
Yeah. So he would say, instead of bailing, because he was anti bailout, because he wasn't strictly there is like a delineation between laissez-faire and libertarian, in the sense that because the libertarian would say the state shouldn't spend money on the soup kitchens, it should just not exist, or or that should be handled by non-state entities. But if you are laissez-faire, you can make the argument that the government shouldn't intervene on behalf of businesses, but it should possibly, like it's not in principle opposed to soup kitchens or schools or whatever, but it can still exist.
Intervene in the people, not intervene in
I
the
mean,
market,
that's quite
basically.
interesting then. At least
I mean, because in the road to serfdom, that's the whole thing with Pinochet. He thinks the most important thing is that they don't interfere with the market. Even dictatorship or whatever, it's fine as long as like he didn't condemn the Soviet Union because they got very involved. He condemned them because they got involved in the market.
that's actually that's interesting and also quite strange.
It is strange. Yeah.
I mean, that's that's the most interesting.
But I mean, he wasn't like, oh, we shouldn't have soup kitchens for everyone. He was still, he just wasn't in principle opposed to it. But he didn't think that that was the secret, that everyone should have food or whatever. It just doesn't rule it out.
That's quite interesting. Sorry, to return it to distributism.
Yeah.
Because you've talked quite extensively about having like a moral critique of presently existing systems, um, which seems to me to be quite fair. Like,
Yeah, I think it's exceedingly fair to say, well, I mean, how come, he's doing quite well, but there are people who don't. So the idea is that if everyone the fundamental idea is that everyone has a little bit of property, and there's not like that much centralized authority. Scrap that centralized power, because they do stress the important distinction between authority and power.
good classical distinction there.
Yeah, for example, they're fine with the Catholic Church, or in the few non-Catholic distributists, the church or whatever religious institution they hold to, having complete moral authority, or even that there exists a state that has complete legal authority, but they're opposed to any particular institution having complete power. So, for example, in the Sturvan states, he claims that the corporations, they don't have authority because they can't legally tell people what to do, but they have a lot of power, and that's the problem.
Yeah, I mean that
In that,
makes
in distributism, the authority is centralized, but the power isn't.
that's quite interesting.
So the power in this case is very directly linked to property. The corporation has power because of its property, or the capitalist has power because of his property. So if everyone has, I don't want to say equal, but has a share in the property, that should prevent any people from getting fucked over too hard.
But from my understanding, Chesterton and Belloc, when they said property, they were talking about like immovable property, like farmland, etc. Or were they also like including like
You can just
more
like
immaterial,
abolish
like intellectual
any
property and stuff
non-material
like that?
property.
No, they were fine with the like that property, because they do talk about shares and bonds and everything as being property. So if you have the
Exactly.
urbanites, if the urbanites all have some share of corporate equity, that could be seen as distributism.
Interesting. I mean,
They probably wouldn't have thought about it like that, but they don't. They, I think if you were to build a 21st century distributism, that because they were more interested in acres and cows because that was the world they lived in. But I don't think there's any reason why that couldn't apply to corporate equity, or even to more immaterial things like in because in the cyber age everyone has a small share of like server power, or like a little bit of space to host something on the internet. I don't see why that couldn't be part of it.
that does seem quite interesting. I mean, the it's quite interesting that they operate with the classical distinction between power and authority, because that does seem to me to, in a lot of ways, solve a lot of the issues that like laissez-faire republicanism has, that or like any kind of libertarianism has, where there seems to be very much an equation of power and authority. Um, I mean, you see this with um, Hans Hermann Hoppe, where like he like just kind of thinks that whatever people does is right, and like you shouldn't interfere with it. Um, so it seems to me that it's very much, for some economists, there is this belief that because we are rational, whatever we have the potential to do is like good, um, and that seems to me to actually be on the basis of this equation of power and authority. Um, but I mean, it is quite interesting that you mention the issue of like hyperurbanization in distributism. Didn't
I mean, they were pretty like ruralist. That I will say that.
Sorry, to actually continue on that thing of being ruralists, wasn't part of the idea of free acres and a cow that it would like reverse the trend of urbanization to a certain degree?
Yeah, I mean they did believe that that was better. That the sort of rural life was in a sense more wholesome, and so because fundamentally
Like,
they didn't believe that more consumption is necessarily more good. So if people are sort of happier and more dignified on the countryside, even if they're poorer, that's fine.
yeah, I mean, it makes sense. It it does seem, to me at least, that the using this as a kind of system of moral critique, um, does also keep it quite greatly in like the continuity of um, Pope Leo actually was doing in Rerum Novarum, where he's sort of attempting to say this is not okay, this is okay, so on and so forth. Which is it's quite interesting that you would argue for a return to that. We
I mean, Chesterton famously said, "There cannot be a nation of millionaires, and there never has been a nation of utopian comrades, but there have been any number of nations of tolerably contented peasants."
I mean, I wouldn't agree with
So
that.
what you're saying is that Chesterton was a Pol Potist then?
I mean, the issue of saying that he was a Pol Potist is that Pol Pot was an ethno-nationalist, and Belloc most certainly wasn't an ethno-nationalist, considering his opinions on the Normans. So I would presume also that like Chesterton wasn't.
I mean, I think both of them would say, and here I think I am putting words into their mouths, but not without reason. They would both argue nations are too big because they were fierce. So, the nation is a very large thing. So they would
60 million of them.
they would put more emphasis on the local community, the village or the town or the county.
But I mean, again, it's this point
Well,
that
and,
he was
and, and
doing
in
that
Pol Pot's
because
case,
he had a
killing
vision
people
of
with
like an
glasses,
ethnically
but
pure utopia and like the educated people, i.e., those with glasses, were like foreign aid, like Vietnamese agents, was like the logic, and that I mean that's an element that people are very quick to forget with Pol Pot, is that like he was from the beginning anti-Chinese, anti-Laotian, anti-Hill tribes, anti-Vietnamese, anti-Thai.
It was anti a lot of things.
Yeah, he was. I mean, he abolished money, so he was at the very least anti-money.
And distributists wouldn't even. I don't think they specifically advocate for abolishing money.
I mean, even I mean, people have like debated about labor vouchers a lot of the time.
Vouchers are money.
Yeah, I
It's
mean
money
that's the issue.
regulations. Because I know that labor voucher advocators do have stipulations to it, like you can't accumulate them and they expire, or you can't invest them.
Yeah, because
That's essentially money with like stipulations to it.
yeah. I mean, doesn't in
I
that
mean
case
those
it
were
just
never a thing.
degenerate back to like
Well,
Those were
pre-monetary
never a thing,
economies
though.
of like cabbages and the stuff?
They
Can't
it's
store it
essentially
infinite
just like a
because it
universal
rots and
like,
stuff like that.
because it's like the purest most simplified form of money. Because what money is, as the classic saying goes, time is money. Because you put time into your work and you get money, and then you can spend money later to save time.
Yeah.
Because instead of spending time growing carrots, you can buy the carrots. Because you don't
Yeah.
have a you know
Yeah, I mean
or if you want to take it very little literal and modern, you can buy the fast pass at Disney World and spend time for money. Save time. I mean, any money transaction is a transaction for time, because time is the only resource that humans have.
yeah. Yeah, I mean pretty much. The that's also why like why, like, they restore rubles and all this. But I think I think it's quite interesting that you mentioned about the critique of nations, because
I don't think they're anti-nations existing. I just don't think they should. Nations aren't
critique of
supposed.
critique of nationalism then, um,
Mm.
because I think there's quite a serious argument to be made that the sort of classical, or the medieval distinction between power and authority that the Catholic Church worked with was part of the reason for why Roman identity was able to break up, and why it was possible for for smaller nations to become a thing. Um, and I think it's probably reasonable to argue that, um, if you had a situation wherein you have centralized authority, distributed power, you would likely see a tendency back towards that situation, i.e., um, a return to the kind of localism that characterized the Middle Ages, because
I mean, Belloc
be-
in his because he was primarily a historian. He does classify medieval England as distributist.
because I mean the thing that I think people forget a lot of the time is that, the medievals were like fairly interconnected, more so than we like give them credit for. Um, Especially like by the time of like Hobbes or whoever. And even then, even in that period, they are still like there's still a lot of local identity that you don't find sort of in more modern times. Um, so it's quite interesting that you do. It's quite interesting that you link the critique of, or it's quite interesting that you say that they would be opposed to how large and powerful nations have become, in the context of their Catholicism, as it
Yeah.
were. I would ask though, I think, with what do you see as the primary advantage in distributism over other, say, more modern political theories, not political theories, economic theories, or um, political economy, what have you?
Well, the thing that the conclusion almost that I wanted to get to is that I don't think that you know that like distributism is really like a sort of an economic school of thought in that way. I think, and I know that you're miffed by this phrase. I think it's a tool of analysis.
Yeah,
So,
I mean,
so I
I
think
like seeing as you have laid out what you mean by tool of analysis. I will retract my earlier critique of the term tool of
I'm mostly
analysis.
just saying that in jest.
I guess that, but no, I mean it seems to me to be quite useful.
Because if you have this idea that distributism is a good thing, if you were to be something of an economic prescriptivist and you were considering economic schools of thought like Fisherianism or post-Keynesianism or whatever, you could say, would implementing this lead to a more or less distributist society? Yeah, it's like an ideal. It's
How it becomes
if
econometrics
you
then.
want to be prescriptive, you can say and you are religious. There's not that many notable atheist distributists, I find, but it's not impossible. I've met that that is like thinkers on the internet. You'll find them. You know, so you could because how do you build a distributism? That's the key flaw. it's distributism doesn't have like a clear, not like a monetary politics, because not monetary policy, because that would be, that is like specifics. It doesn't have an idea of what interest rates should be, or should we have a centralized interest rate, or like what the nature of financial markets should be, or how to prevent a distributed society sliding into capitalism by the, by the because the property gets aggregated in very few people. It does not have the answers to those questions, and I think you need to find those answers in like a broader pool of economic thinking. But I think it's a good concept to have in mind. Yeah, it's a
Consider
prescriptive
it
tool.
like a category
It's
of prescriptive economics then?
it's yeah, it's not, but you can also use it in economic history. You can say, oh, in this period,
Like a then, like
this thing, right? No, I mean Belloc does this, saying, the two examples that come to mind are 19th century Denmark and medieval England. He claims that was they had a distributist system.
I mean, this all does seem to me quite interesting.
So I don't think that calling yourself a distributist is helpful. No, I don't. It is helpful. I don't think it's enough. I think you have to be, like it's okay to say you're distributist, that you think that's like a good prescription of the world, but you have to have, well, you don't have to have, but because you can say I don't know, but if you were to have an answer, you would have to say, oh, and this and that, and I have these other thoughts relating to economics on these fields. You're not forced to have an opinion. I'm just saying you either have to concede that you don't know or have one. And saying that I don't know is a much better answer than spouting up some nonsense.
If you do say that you don't know, isn't it already admitting that it is a tool of critique rather than a prescriptive system? Especially if um, you can say,
Yeah, but a lot of people don't say they don't know. A lot of people just say, I am a distributist, full stop, and then they don't give an answer. They don't say that they don't know, because they just assume they do know, and that it's all wrapped up in distributism. There are people. I would go as far as to say most people on the internet you'll find labeling themselves as distributist, whatever that means, sort of saying that is like the fullness of their thinking. I would say I'm a distributist in the sense that I think that's a good model, because not everyone would, but I think it's a good goal. I just and I have a lot of other thoughts that I don't think you could fit into this without making the podcast 12 hours long, and also that, as both of you will know, I can get very detailed and boring about it, but that's pretty much, yeah.
I mean, it seems to me a much more coherent set of ideas than what most people talk about when they talk about distributism. Um, for the very
Because I don't think, yeah, I
point.
mean, because distributism in and of itself isn't coherent. It doesn't have the ability, and I would argue it doesn't have the need.
Yeah, I mean that I think actually solves a lot of issues and is then quite useful. I think that's yeah. I mean, I think that's
So like in my ideal world, like you could have people saying, "Oh, I'm a you could say you're a distributist Marxist." That would be or a distributist post Keynesian, or a distributist Austrian. Even I think that could be, like you could make a sort of like a laissez-faire argument for distributism. I don't know that I would, but I think it is.
Most aren't. I think most Austrians are. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised because the most of them kind of dream of a society of smallholders, basically. You know, the Jeffersonian dream. It just doesn't seem to me to be very coherent as to how they think they'll get that.
No, I don't think they have it sort of figured out as such, and I don't have it fully. You know, I don't know that anyone has it fully figured out, but I don't think they. I think they're missing a lot of pieces in that.
Yeah, and that I think is probably the biggest issue with them. Other than them, you know, taking money from millionaires or whatever, or being Hans Hermann Hoppe, and his whole jazz.
Yeah,
I
but that's you know, there's not many people in economics who take him that seriously. Hop. That sort of
By
underlines my
God, no,
point there.
is he popular with the
Yeah, I mean-
ANCAPs?
Because like, and you know, I might alienate some people, but ANCAPs, come on, really,
True
Yeah.
enough.
really, come on. That's pretty much the thing. I think our viewers should consider that distributism is
just-
not in an, because it's often labeled
Just
as an ideal, and I think even if you asked Belloc or Chesterton, they would say, oh, yeah, this is the school of thought. This is it. In a way that I think we need to move on from, to say that, oh, it is this tool of analysis. So I think that's our hot take. That's pretty much like a good place to leave it, I think. No, I mean, in the sense that
yeah,
Occam's razor is
distributism, the new
tool of
Occam's
analysis, I
razor.
guess, but it's not.
Oh
it's
wait,
not
that made no
much like
sense.
Occam's
God,
razor.
that.
I mean, yeah, I mean,
Distributism, the new city of God. That's perhaps
Claire
not.
Belloc, Norman Yoke on English Oak. I think that's the conclusion. I think that this has been a good podcast. I am.
Bronze. Good night.
And this has been Monarchism Unfiltered.